Welcome to Global Minnesota Podcast, connecting, informing, and engaging Minnesotans with the world and exploring important international issues. For a complete list of programs and to join us, visit globalminnesota.org.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Minnesota, my second home, as it was mentioned. I have noticed a certain pattern. I think it was about 5 years ago I was here last, and it's a pattern because I speak on Middle Eastern issues, which tends to depress people quite a lot, and it usually takes 5 years before you're willing to invite me back. I will change my topic to Scandinavian geopolitics. I'm sure I will be here every 3 weeks. I'm here to talk to you about the nuclear deal with Iran, the current situation that is taking place there, and the very negative trajectory of relations that we're seeing right now. And I want to address what is happening right now, but I think it's critical for us to understand better why we are where we are by first understanding how did we start off and how did we actually end up getting a deal that we now have lost, and what the politics and all of the efforts that went into that. It is the topic of my third book, and much like what I opened up here with this issue being somewhat depressing, I was really hoping that this book would be different from my two previous books, which dealt with the geopolitics of the Middle East, because those books showed the very large number of missed opportunities for diplomacy. And every time we missed an opportunity, we moved closer and closer towards a military confrontation. But for the third book, that dealt with the nuclear deal, finally, we actually had what I would call a triumph of diplomacy. Now, not a triumph of diplomacy in the sense that it actually created peace between Iran and the United States, but because it created an opportunity to lose an enemy, an opportunity that could not be actualized unless we continue to invest in it, which in my view, unfortunately, we have not. But if we understand what it took to actually reach that deal, I think we may be able to recreate a situation in which opportunities to lose enemies in the Middle East once again can be resurrected. For the nuclear talks and for this third book, I found myself in a rather unique situation. I was advising the Obama administration on the nuclear talks because my organization had been pushing for a diplomatic solution for quite some time. And at the same time, I did have access to the Iranian side because of my previous books. I had interviewed many of those players there as well. So it wasn't unusual that I actually could be at the White House on a Wednesday for a briefing, and then a couple of days later fly to Geneva or Lausanne, where the talks were taking place, and end up having a 2-hour conversation with the Iranian foreign minister, getting their perspective on things. So I had this ability to be able to see the fears, the calculations, the strategies and tactics of both sides pretty much up close. And I thought it would be quite valuable to take advantage of this front seat privilege that I had to tell the story of how an international crisis that truly was on the verge of a military confrontation actually was resolved peacefully through diplomacy, without a single shot being fired and without a single angry 6 a.m. tweet being sent off. And make sure that the American public would be able to reconnect and rediscover what a tremendous capacity the United States does have for resolving conflicts diplomatically when it really puts its mind to it and when it pursues smart policies instead of falling into the trap of the idea that we constantly have to come across as tough and strong. Now, in order to better understand what the value of this deal is, we have to recognize that it's not just about the nuclear issue. It was truly about the geopolitics, the balance of power in the region, and the difference between war and peace. And that's where I want to start off. I want to take you back to April 2012. At a time when the United States was imposing very strict sanctions on the Iranians were aggressively going forward with their nuclear program. There were constant threats of potential military action by Israel. In the midst of all of this, a most unusual group of people got together in a very small country in Europe, far away from the eyes of the media. In that group, there were several Iranian diplomats, including 2 members of the nuclear negotiating team. There were several American officials, including a very senior American general. And perhaps most surprisingly, 5 senior Israelis, including one who certainly deserved the rank of being a senior official. But what was perhaps most surprising was not just who was there, but actually what was being said at this meeting. And I'm going to give you a quote. "This is not about enrichment. It was never about enrichment." The Israeli official looked straight into the eyes of the Iranians across the rooms and uttered these words, leaving all of us somewhat baffled. For more than 20 years, the Israelis had said that Iran's nuclear program, particularly its enrichment of uranium, constituted an existential threat to Israel. But now, instead, the Israelis were telling the Iranians straight to their face, actually, it wasn't about enrichment. And he went on and said what Israel was looking for is what he called a sweeping attitude change on behalf of Iran. And that meant, he explained, that the Israelis could not accept that the United States would come to terms with Iran without Iran coming to terms with Israel. That Iran, if it continued to question Israel's right to exist, it could not accept the United States striking a deal with Iran, because that would be the abandonment of Israel from their perspective. Because it would mean that the United States would resolve the core issue of conflict with Iran. It wouldn't resolve everything but the core issue. And then move on to other global crises, because the United States is a global superpower, leaving Israel abandoned in the region, facing still a hostile Iran, but now without the full backing of the United States. Given that, it was made clear Israel would do everything in its power to prevent any kind of a deal to be struck, precisely to avoid that type of an abandonment. This was not just a moment of honesty. This is certainly different from the talking points you would hear on Fox or on CNN or MSNBC. But it was also a moment of utmost clarity about what the actual driving forces of this conflict was. To better understand the Israeli perspective, I think we have to go back another 2 decades to understand the shifts in balance of power in the region that led up to this situation. We need to go back to 1991, 1992. You had 2 major geopolitical shocks taking place in this period. First, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and secondly, the United States defeats Iraq together with the UN coalition in the Second Persian Gulf War. And these 2 shocks essentially changed the geopolitics of the globe and the region. Globally now, the United States was the sole superpower of the world. Regionally, the old balance of power had now been disrupted, but it was not clear what would come to replace it. And that void, that uncertainty of what the new security architecture of the region would be, pitted strong countries in the region into a rivalry trying to define what the new balance of power would be. And this pitted also Iran and Israel against each other, which was kind of odd, because prior to this, even during the Islamic Republic, Israelis and the Iranians actually shared common security imperatives, and behind the scenes continued a secret security collaboration. The driving forces of that was that they both had shared common threats. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, as well as the Soviet Union. These factors started already back in the 50s, but they survived even after the Islamic Republic came into power. That's why we had these rather bizarre situations in the 1980s, I'm sure many here remember, the Iran-Contra scandal, which was an effort by the Israelis to bring the United States and Iran back on talking terms, because back in the 80s, it was actually the Israelis that were lobbying Washington to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric because it wasn't actually reflective of their real policies. But now, after 1991-92, those 2 key factors, the Soviet Union and the threat from Iraq, were now gone. And instead you had a new geopolitical constellation in the region. The Israelis moved first, making the argument to Washington that in order for Israel to take a risk for peacemaking with the Palestinians, which the Bush senior administration made a big push for, the United States needed to isolate, contain, and sanction Iran, because Iran was now the new threat. And this argument eventually was adopted by the Clinton administration and became the doctrine of the dual containment policy. Now the U.S., instead of pursuing a policy of trying to bring in the Iranians in from the cold, which was the Iranians were looking for, it was now going to create a new order in the region based on Iraq and Iran's prolonged isolation and putting Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt at the center of this new order. For the Israelis, this was exactly what they wanted. For the Iranians, this was absolutely the last thing that they had hoped for. And they did everything they could to undermine dual containment. And in their perspective, in their calculation, the weakest link of this policy was the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If the peace process could be sabotaged, all of the other objectives of the United States and Israel would also fail to come to fruition. So they moved aggressively, started supporting organizations that use violence and terror against Israel in their effort to sabotage the peace process in order to sabotage dual containment. But after everything they did, and they really tried hard, it actually was not the Iranians that caused the collapse of dual containment. It was the United States itself. More precisely, George W. Bush. Because by going into Iraq and pursuing a policy of regime change, the idea of containing Iraq, of course, was now ended. And in the process, because Iraq ended up being such a failure, not only did the United States fail to create a new order in the region, a new balance of power, it weakened itself to the point in which it no longer had the capacity to impose on the region a new equilibrium. Essentially, the region became orderless, particularly after 2005. There was no superpower or hegemon that could create an order. There was no constellation or combination of powers could do so. And this is one of the reasons as to why the region is still suffering from so much instability. We're in the middle of the process of going from one balance to the next. And that process, by definition, tends to be the most unstable periods for a region. Now, as the United States goes into Iraq, for the Israelis and for the Saudis, this was a very negative development, because what it ended up doing is that it unleashed Iran. It took out the Taliban government in Afghanistan, took out Saddam Hussein, and it enabled the Iranians to spread their power. And so for the Iranians, they actually saw this as a significant positive. Of course, the Bush administration pursued a very, very aggressive policy towards Iran, but for the Iranians, being able to now be in this new situation in which the U.S. really lacked the capacity of continuing to isolate Iran in the way that it had done in the 1990s was very beneficial. They were just suffering from one very specific problem. As long as they could not get recognition from the United States that Iran is a major power in the region, they could not lock in this new beneficial balance in the region. They needed a crisis, something that would force the United States to come to the negotiating table, calculating that if they have a deal with the United States, by definition, it would give them the recognition and it would end the U.S.'s containment policy once and for all. And it's precisely for this reason that the Iranians wanted this, that the Israelis were so adamant about preventing diplomacy, because they recognized that if there was a deal, the U.S. would no longer pursue a policy of absolute containment and constantly be pushing back against Iran. Ironically, however, the Israelis and the Iranians used the same instrument to achieve opposite objectives, and that was the nuclear program. For the Israelis, a threatening existential threat, a program that was, and a policy they pursued in which they essentially made such unrealistic demands in order to ensure that no compromise could be found. If you have a position of making it impossible to get a compromise and you define the problem as existential, it essentially leaves the United States with no option but to take military action at some point. And once the United States had taken on Iran militarily, the balance of power that would ensue, of course, would be much more beneficial to the Israelis. That was their calculation. The Iranian calculation was quite different. Yes, aggressively pursuing a nuclear program could definitely bring about a military confrontation. But precisely because of the failure of the Iraq War, precisely because of the fatigue of the American public when it came to more wars in the region, the calculation was that if they advance aggressively, it would force the United States to come to the table and change its policy on the core issue of enrichment and strike a deal with the Iranians. And this was the crux of the problem for the United States. How do you prevent the Iranians from having an option for a nuclear weapon without going to war, without allowing the Israelis to start a war, and without putting the Iranians in a position in which, if there was a negotiation, they would be in a position to define the new balance of power in the region? That was the crux of the problem from the American side. Now, the policy that the Bush administration pursued was one in which they refused negotiations, believing if they negotiate with the Iranians, they would bring American legitimacy onto the Iranians. And they pursued a policy that was essentially overwhelmingly focused on pressure, sabotage, and other coercive measures such as economic sanctions. The track record for that policy, I think, is quite clear. In 2003, the Iranians had roughly 150 centrifuges. Those are the machines that spin and enriches uranium to higher levels, which you then later on can use for a nuclear weapon. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 8,000 centrifuges. Iran had 0 kilos of low-enriched uranium. It's the enriched uranium to about 3.75%. You can only use it for fuel for reactors, but if you enrich it further, you can use it for weapons. They had 0 kilos in 2003. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 1,500 kilos. Enough to be able to build one bomb. So clearly a new approach was needed. And when Obama decided to run for president, he made the idea of diplomacy with America's enemies a center stage of his foreign policy platform. And it wasn't just about Iran, it was about Cuba, it was Venezuela. It was an idea of reconstituting diplomacy at the center of American statecraft. Iran became the poster child for that policy, though. But Obama quickly learned that talking about diplomacy with Iran as a state senator from Illinois is much simpler than actually conducting diplomacy with the Iranians. And within a year, after one failed attempt at diplomacy, which largely was because of problems on the Iranian side, Obama found himself pretty much in the same position as Bush was in. The only instruments that he had at his disposal was economic sanctions, cyber sabotage, and other coercive measures. But there was one significant difference. Precisely because Obama had pursued diplomacy, which Bush had not, he had far greater ability to convince other countries to go along with the sanctions policy, because he said that he could say that he had tried diplomacy. And precisely because he had a larger degree of international popularity and acceptance, he had a better way of being able to even convince countries that were very reluctant to go along with this policy. And the United States, as a result, under Obama, managed to impose crippling sanctions on the Iranians that were tremendously painful to their economy. Just to give you a couple of examples, they managed to convince the Europeans to completely end their purchases of oil from Iran. 40% of Iran's oil was being sold to Europe, went down to 0 within 6 months. Sanctions on the central bank of Iran, which effectively cut off Iran from the international financial system. The Iranian currency dropped 30% the day that bill passed in the Senate. The estimation of the Obama administration is that the Iranian economy roughly contracted 25% over the course of 3 years as a result of these sanctions. Without a doubt, the sanctions were painful. And very clearly, the Iranians had underestimated Obama because they never thought anyone would be able to get that degree of international acceptance and buy-in for a sanctions regime. But Obama had also underestimated the Iranians. Clearly, they were hurting, but they were not breaking, nor were they without a response. If the American strategy with the sanction was to essentially change Iran's cost-benefit analysis, make it realize that pursuing this nuclear program was simply too costly for them, push them to a point in which they had to choose between having a nuclear program and having an economy. The Iranian calculation and their response was based on a mirror image of that calculation, which was they're going to double down on their nuclear program and convince the United States that sanctions will only beget more centrifuges. The more Iran is sanctioned, the more Iran will advance on the nuclear program in order to essentially disabuse the United States of the belief that Iran would break under sanctions. Instead, Iran would move closer towards a nuclear option. And this is where a race then begins. 2 ticking clocks, actually 3 ticking clocks. You had the American sanctions clock. You had the Iranian nuclear clock, in which they were trying to enforce on the U.S. a nuclear fait accompli. And you also had the wild card of the Israeli clock of a potential military action taken by the Israelis, which would completely disrupt the situation, of course. As these clocks were ticking, there was an ongoing diplomatic process at the P5+1 level. That's the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. It was not a particularly productive thing. It was mainly there to ensure that some degree of diplomacy was alive, but it wasn't as if anything for real was being achieved. There was a need for something else, and there was a senator at the time who managed to convince Obama that if you really want to see the Iranians compromise or even capitulate, it's not going to happen in the P5+1. There has to be a direct channel to Iran's supreme leader in a secret negotiation far away from where the media is, because only there could the Iranians be able to give in on anything. That senator was John Kerry, who later on, of course, ended up becoming Secretary of State. And he convinced Obama to initiate a channel in the country of Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. Oman had actually been very helpful in winning the release of 3 Americans. You probably heard of them as the 3 American hikers who had been wrongfully imprisoned in Iran and accused of spying. It's a rather sad story. These guys hiked once in their life, and now they're forever known to be the American hikers. They were actually accomplished journalists, writers, authors, and they were actually not in Iran. They were hiking in a part of Iraqi Kurdistan in which the border is not marked. They saw a couple of soldiers waving them over. They went over to see what they wanted. Unbeknownst to them, they entered Iranian territory, were arrested and accused of espionage. The Omanis quietly worked in the background, won their release, and they did so because they wanted to prove to the United States that Oman has this unique capacity of maneuvering the Iranian political landscape. And they did so because they wanted to convince the United States to use Oman's good offices in order to resolve the nuclear issue, because they were terrified that it otherwise would lead to another military confrontation in Iran. So, July 2012, a first meeting is held in Oman. 2 mid-level American officials go there, an equal number from the Iranian side. In the first meetings, the Omanis were sitting in there as well to give an alibi so that it didn't come across as an Iran-US bilateral meeting. But it was an utter failure because the 2 sides came in with very different expectations. From the American side, this was aimed at seeing, is this really an authoritative channel, a channel that goes to the supreme leader, that has the backing of the top leadership of Iran? And secondly, to see how close are the Iranians to capitulating because of all the pressure that they're under. The Iranians came for a completely different reason. They came to see how close is the United States to capitulate on the issue of enrichment. So the 2 sides clearly talked past each other. They had different expectations, and they left quite disappointed, and there was a significant risk that the channel as a whole would collapse. Then you had the elections in the United States in November 2012. These things were put on hold. But by January 2013, just a couple of months after the elections, a completely new sense of danger is dawning on, an urgency is dawning on the White House. Exactly a year earlier, January 2012, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta had publicly stated that Iran's breakout capability is 12 months, meaning the time it would take for the Iranians from the moment they make a political decision to build a nuclear weapon to them having the ready material for a nuclear weapon. The estimation was that it would take 12 months. By January 2013, as a result of the Iranians aggressively going forward with their nuclear program in response to the sanctions, Iran's breakout capability was now only 8 to 12 weeks. Clearly, the Iranian nuclear clock was ticking faster than the sanctions clock. And the president realized that if nothing changed and they just continued to go with the sanctions strategy, in a couple of months, the United States would only be faced with two options: either accepting Iran as a de facto nuclear power or go to war, unless something would change. That's why there was a decision made to go back to the Oman Channel for a second meeting. That meeting was held in March 2013. And this time around, the United States did not just send two mid-level officials. Instead, a full delegation headed by then Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, as well as several of the top non-proliferation experts on the American side. But perhaps most importantly, for the first time ever, the American diplomats were armed with an instrument that they had never been allowed to touch before, which was a very carefully worded statement declaring under what circumstances the United States would be willing to accept enrichment on Iranian soil. This has long been the long-standing Iranian red line. They would essentially be willing to endure any pressure, but they would not give in on this key issue. And this was the key issue, of course, that the Bush administration had refused to agree to. They wanted zero enrichment. And there was the expectation that this would now be a breakthrough, because the two sides essentially were getting much, much closer to each other on the issue of substance. But unfortunately, after almost 40 years of mutual demonization and mistrust, even moving closer to each other on an issue of substance was not enough, precisely because of the deep mistrust that existed. The Iranians could not go back to Tehran and just say, well, the Americans promised they would accept enrichment. They needed it in writing. The Americans were forbidden to put it in writing, because if they did, the fear was that this could leak, this could sabotage the P5+1 negotiations. In fact, this card, the enrichment card, was considered the strongest incentive, best bargaining card the US had. It was supposed to be played in tandem with the Europeans. Instead, now the US played it behind Europe's back. And there was great fear that if this leaked, it would sabotage the P5+1 talks. But also there was a fear that the Iranians would just pocket the concession and give nothing back in return. So the question then was, okay, if we have this deep mistrust, who is out there that has the capacity of bridging the mistrust between the United States and Iran? Does Obama and Khamenei have like a common Facebook friend that could step in and mediate on this? And it was essentially one person, and that's the Sultan of Oman. And the idea emerged that if the United States cannot put this in writing to the Iranians because of the risk that I just mentioned, perhaps the US could send a letter to the Sultan of Oman, spell out the American position, and then the Sultan would go to Tehran, meet with Ayatollah Khamenei face to face in between his chemotherapy, and without sharing the letter or showing them the letter, convey the contents of that letter to the Iranians. If the Iranians then still express mistrust, that mistrust would no longer be towards the United States. It would be towards the Sultan. And precisely because they had such a strong relationship with the Sultan, the calculation was that this is how the deadlock on this issue would be resolved. And that's how it happened. And incidentally, all of this is happening while Ahmadinejad is still president, before Rouhani came into power. Now, Ahmadinejad was opposed to this process, and he had very little to do with it. But it happened before Rouhani got elected. When Rouhani got elected, of course, optimism about making sure that this could go further grew significantly, because it was a completely different government. But he had no idea that any of this actually had taken place until he became president. I wanted to tell this part of the story because I think it demonstrates a couple of things. It demonstrates, first of all, how creative and important diplomacy is to be able to overcome issues, that even a country as powerful as the United States cannot translate that power into effective diplomacy without having friends involved. Even a country as the United States still needs to have friends to be able to overcome differences and difficulties in diplomacy. Secondly, I think it's also important because we hear so much about Sunni-Shia tensions. We hear so much about Arab-Persian tensions, and they're there. There's no denying. But we should also remember that it was an Arab country that brought the United States and Iran closer on this issue. Now, after this, of course, Rouhani gets elected, the diplomacy moves back to the P5+1 channel, becomes very effective, still very, very hard. It takes another 20 or so months before the deal is struck. The deal is struck in July 2015, and in its simplest form, and we can go into more details during the Q&A, it essentially takes two very bad options off the table. The option of the Iranians being able to build a nuclear weapon, and the option of the United States going to war with Iran. Before I leave, though, I want to say a couple of other things about what happened here. First of all, a few words on the position of the Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. Throughout all of this, he truly positioned himself as the number one enemy of the deal and of diplomacy. And he did everything he could to make sure that diplomacy would fail, including going to Congress and doing something unprecedented, speaking out in Congress against the sitting president of the United States. But of everything he did, which failed, up until recently, of course, there was something much, much simpler Netanyahu could have done that would actually very quickly have caused the collapse of the negotiations. Instead of calling this deal the best deal of the century for Iran and the defeat of the West, Netanyahu could have gone to the TV cameras and said, "We in Israel love this deal. This is a fantastic deal. This is Iran's capitulation, and this is Israel's victory." If he had done so, in a conversation with Zarif, I asked him specifically, "What would you have done if Bibi hugged the deal?" He said, "We would have had to walk out of the negotiations." Because it was very easy for the Iranians to deal with Bibi saying that this is a victory for Iran and this is such a bad deal for the West. But if he had said that this is a really horrible deal for the Iranians and a great deal for Israel, the political pressure on the Iranian negotiating team would have been such that they would have been forced to walk out. But in all his wisdom, he never thought of that option. Secondly, we hear a lot, and particularly today, mindful of the fact that Trump has violated and walked out of the deal, that there was a better deal that could be had. That Obama ultimately was a bad negotiator. He could have just put more pressure, continued with the sanctions further, and we would have gotten a better deal. And the Obama administration's response is, this was the best possible deal that could have been had at that moment. My view is that there actually was a better deal. But it wasn't a better deal that existed in 2015. It was a better deal that existed much, much earlier. There are plenty of missed opportunities in which better deals could have been had. In 2003, the Iranians sent a proposal, a grand bargain proposal, to the Americans via the Swiss ambassador in Tehran, who had been tasked by the US to be the go-between between the two countries. In this grand bargain, they're talking about opening up the nuclear program for full transparency, collaborating with the United States in Iraq in order to ensure that Iraq would be stabilized and not have a sectarian government, collaborating against terrorist organizations, above all Al-Qaeda. And when it came to the nuclear issue, opening it up for full transparency, which was a bit of a vague phrase. But nevertheless, it was a rather stunning proposal that had been put in place. I saw it because at the time I was working in Congress, and the Swiss ambassador actually gave us a copy as well, wanted to make sure that it got to the president. My boss sent it to the White House through an aide. Within 2 hours, Karl Rove, which was Bush's key advisor, called back. He said that he found it intriguing. He wanted to know if it was authentic, and we said, well, it came through the Swiss. Their job is to vet these things. And that's the last thing we heard from him. Until 4 months later, there was an article in the Financial Times saying that some sort of a peace offer, some sort of a negotiation offer had been made by the Iranians through the Swiss to the Bush administration, and the Bush administration had decided to not respond to the Iranians at all, but instead reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered it in the first place. At the time, the Iranians had, as I mentioned earlier on, 150 centrifuges. Another proposal was sent in March 2005. This is the last proposal before Ahmadinejad becomes president and things move very quickly in a negative direction. This one, the Iranians offered to stop their enrichment program at 3,000 centrifuges. The Europeans never bothered to send it to the Americans, knowing that Bush would not accept anything above zero anyways. In one of the briefings at the White House, I don't remember who, but someone mentioned that proposal and asked one of the negotiators, where do you think you'll end up on centrifuges? Do you think you'll end up with the Iranians having more than 3,000 or less? And the response was, oh, if we could still get that proposal, we would jump on that proposal today, but that ship has sailed. A couple of weeks later, I'm in Lausanne. I'm having an interview with Zarif. I'm trying to get the same information from him. Where do you think you'll end up? Do you think you'll end up getting more or less than what you offered in 2005? And he laughed and he said, 3,000? 3,000 was just an opening bid. We were going to settle for 1,000. But we never pursued that either. By the time a deal was struck, when the interim deal was struck in November 2013, the Iranians had 22,000 centrifuges. Their stockpile of LEU had grown to 10,000 kilos, enough for 8 to 10 bombs. Their knowledge about the nuclear fuel cycle was more or less complete. Their stockpile of medium-enriched uranium, 19.75%, was roughly 190 kilos. As a result of the deal that was struck in 2015, the Iranians go back to 5,000 centrifuges. And they ship out 98% of their, or 97% of their stockpile. But essentially, in 2005, we could have potentially have gotten a deal that would have been 2,000 to 4,000 centrifuges less than what we settled for after a decade of sanctions. This is the cost of not pursuing diplomacy. This is the cost of pursuing a policy that combines very unrealistic demands with only pressure instruments and policies. And I think that's an important lesson today, because the reasoning of the current administration is, we're going to get a better deal, we're just going to go back to the table, we're going to impose massive pressure on the Iranians, and massive pressure is being imposed on the Iranians without a doubt. But the question we always have to ask ourselves, is the other side just going to sit still, or do they have capacity of being able to move in directions that would put a lot of pressure on the United States? If the Iranians restart their program, if they also walk out of this deal, there's reasons to believe that they can go back to where they were in 2013 within a couple of weeks, because now they have much more advanced centrifuges that that they're not putting into place, but they have them. So the idea that we can get a better deal by just being tougher was not actually what caused it to work the first time around. It was because we became more reasonable and we pursued more realistic policies. And right now my fear is we're going in the opposite direction. And mindful of what we're doing with North Korea, my fear is that the Iranians are concluding that the deal they had, that they lived up to, according to the IEA, got lost. But the North Koreans got their deal because they actually had nuclear weapons and Iran didn't. That's the wrong conclusion we want to leave them with. Thank you so much. Invite up Ambassador Bolster to come for the Q&A.